Tonight, Mika Zibanejad becomes the 422nd player in the history of the National Hockey League to play 1,000 career games. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new endeavor, the Theory of Hockey show. I am Nick Zararis. I have hosted Locked On Oilers, Locked On Flames. I am still the host on Locked On Oilers. I host Locked On NHL Thursdays with Hunter Hodes of Locked On Penguins. I write the Theory of Hockey on Substack. I have been publishing digital hockey content for more than 10 years. And this project is a passion. This idea, the theory of hockey, trying to explain and be able to dictate and direct everything we do here on this show through the lens of what does this mean, why is this important, and why do you care? Today's show, the first episode on the theory of hockey, is going to be a retrospective on the career of Mika Zibanejad as a New York Ranger. We will not be endeavoring into those first few seasons of Zibanejad's career, where he was a member of the Ottawa Senators. We are going to break down Zibanejad's Rangers tenure through a few different lenses. We'll start out with just the all-time value play, why that trade for Derek Brassard in a second-round pick was such a swing, such a good move for the Rangers. We'll pivot to talking about Zibanejad's context within Rangers history. We'll talk about his historical context as far as where he fits in the landscape of star players during his tenure. We'll do a bit of a critique. We'll go into the bigger games, the more important ones, how Zibanejad performed in them, what his playoff resume says about him as a player. And then we'll tie a bow on the show, just kind of giving a player his due. So to start out, coming out of that 2011-12, the first time they make the conference finals where they lose to the Devils in Game 6, through 2017 when they lose to Ottawa in the second round. That's the first real wave of Rangers contender status. And if you want to be blunt, you could argue that the Rangers window of contention as far as Stanley Cup goes closes after 2015. When they lose to the Lightning in 2015, they have to trade Cam Talbot, they have to trade Carl Hagelin. They endure the brain drain that chronic contenders do. The Rangers make the conference finals in 2012. They make the second round in 2013. They make the Stanley Cup final in 2014. They make the conference final in 2015. They lose in round one to Pittsburgh in 2016, and then they lose in the second round to Ottawa in 2017, and they do not return to the playoffs proper until 2022. When the Rangers acquire Mika Zibanejad in the summer of 2016, they are at an interesting inflection point in their window, because after 2015, the Rangers could have taken a step back and said, we don't have the right mix. We went to a cup final, we went to a conference final, and things went wrong. We played a really close cup final against the Kings that went to overtime 3 times, double overtime twice. In the conference finals against Tampa Bay, we didn't have Matt Zuccarello, one of our leading scorers. We could not defense and goaltending our way to a Stanley Cup in that window. But with the pieces in place after 2015 that were still there, they gave it one last crack. That team, the 15-16 team that traded for Eric Stahl at the deadline, was not of the same caliber of the previous 2 iterations. That summer, the impetus to start to look towards a future comes onto the horizon, because you're not at a point where you're really thinking about starting from scratch. You still have Henrik Lundqvist as one of the highest paid goalies in the NHL. Sergei Bobrovsky will pass that in a couple of years in free agency. But summer 2016, you still have Derek Stepan, you have Derek Brassard, you have Kevin Hayes down the middle. That's a really solid 1 through 3. You have Dominic Moore, who plays, I believe, one more year and then walks. You have 4 solid centers on your cohort. You still have Rick Nash, you have Zuccarello. You need to start to identify that next wave of guys. Amongst that next wave of guys, JT Miller, the aforementioned Kevin Hayes, Brady Shea. You start to look towards, okay, we need to supplement Henrik Lundqvist's supporting cast. We need to give that wave, that group of Stepan, Nash, Chris Kreider, who I failed to mention before, Hank, McDonough, we need to give that group of guys their next wave. We need to give that group of guys reinforcements. And the Rangers, to their credit, did do a reasonable job on paper. If you go just on paper, and we're operating theoretically still here, you think about adding Buchnevich and Jimmy Vesey and Kevin Hayes and JT Miller, you have a decent supporting cast on the way to augment the group that's already established. The problem ultimately becomes costs and where your costs are tied up. You're still committed to Mark Stahl for several more years. You don't have as much flexibility as you would want. And going into that summer of 2016, the Rangers were ripe for some transition to start looking towards how do we sustain being contenders for a while. They swing the trade for Zibanejad, and to that point, Zibanejad had not demonstrated a ton as a member of the Senators, but at the very least was still a very highly sought after player as being a former first round pick and not in the copy pasta tweet kind of turbo dog shit kind of way, but in a this is a good player who needs a change of scenery, and on a Rangers team where he's going to go behind Derek Stepan in the pecking order and have Kevin Hayes to kind of buffer him to between a second and third line center. It's a team that has won in recent memory, that has been consistently in the postseason. It's a bit of an easier situation for him where he's not going to have the weight of the world on his shoulders the way he did in Ottawa. That first year with the Rangers, 16-17, goes a little bit better than expected. The Rangers are a wild card team. They go to the Atlantic half of the bracket. They beat Montreal in the first round. Zibanejad scores his one overtime game-winning goal in a series the Rangers won in that Montreal series in overtime, Game 5. Creates one of my favorite quotes of all time, the Rick Nash, good players find the puck finds good players in overtime. That's what happens. And Zibanejad scores that. They go on and win in 6. They go to the next round against Ottawa. The Vigneault regime entirely collapses there. The consistent play of Mark Stahl and Nick Holden over Brady Shea and Brendan Smith, who were the Rangers' best defensive pair at that point in the postseason. And that's where you really start to take a step back and say, damn, we missed our shot. And 17-18 plays out in a really unique way, because when the Rangers get to their open practice, December 2nd or 3rd of 2017 going into 2018, they're dealing with injuries. The Winter Classic is on the horizon. This is a team that has the talent to make the postseason if things shake out. If you'll remember, you still have Chris Kreider, you have Mika Zibanejad, you have Matt Zuccarello, you have Rick Nash, you have Kevin Hayes, you have JT Miller. That's a really solid top 6. You still have Michael Grabner, who was one of the league leaders in even strength goals the year before. You have a really solid top 9 to 10 forwards to play with there. You have Jimmy Vesey as well. You have pieces, but the injuries rack their toll. Ryan McDonough plays most of that year injured. And when the time comes at the trade deadline, Jeff Gorton folds. He recognizes we are not going to make the playoffs this year. I need to trade off my expiring assets. They trade Rick Nash to Boston. They trade Zuccarello to Dallas. The year later, they trade that same year, they trade Kevin Hayes to Winnipeg. All of those trades make sense in a vacuum. You have Zibanejad stay. And that's really the first point I think that's interesting in evaluating Zibanejad's tenure, where we're going on this upcoming summer will be his 10th year in the Ranger organization. This is a guy who kickstarted an initial rebuild, rode out a rebuild from 17-18, 18-19, 19-20, 20-21 to 21-22. This is a guy who was here long enough to ride out both ends of a rebuild, who lived through the entire life cycle of starting over, building up, window of contention, and starting over again. And it takes a certain caliber of player to have both the equity within the organization to justify hanging around that long, and a certain talent level to hang around this long. And the former first round pick, the former top 5 pick, that has merit. You know, that having that threshold as being your starting point for an NHL career, it's going to afford you more opportunities. You know, if the Rangers had grown frustrated with Zibanejad after 3 or 4 years, they absolutely could have turned him into that liquidity party they did. They didn't. They could have turned Chris Kreider into that liquidity party as well between 2018 and 2020, where if they really wanted to start looking towards whatever the next window is going to be that started in 2021 or 2022, you could have turned Zibanejad around. And he rides out 4 tough years in his physical prime. Ages 24 to 27 are the years the Rangers missed the playoffs. I know they go to the playoffs in 2020, but that was such a debacle against the Hurricanes. I really struggled to consider that, A, worth mentioning, and B, playoff experience. That team was entirely overmatched, did not really belong in the postseason to begin with, was only there because of the expanded playoff format. And you add in the fact that going into 2021, 2022. After the way 2021 ends, where everything feels like the sky is falling, you have the Tom Wilson incident. You have the large-scale firing of the front office and the coach. You bring in Chris Drury, and Chris Drury, you hear the Jack Eichel name in the rumor mill, and the Rangers are very interested in Jack Eichel, and they spend that entire summer playing footsie with the Sabres, trying to trade for Eichel, trying to get him to New York, because this is a team that knows it needs more. And ultimately, the minute Chris Drury signs Mika Zibanejad to that 8-year, $8.5 million deal, which is in effect through 2030, when Zibanejad will be 37 years old, the Rangers made their line in the sand. The Rangers made their choice. And we're going to talk more about that later. But I do want to highlight some of the milestones here. So tonight, Zibanejad will play his 1,000th career NHL game. He's at 718, 719 after tonight as a Ranger. The all-time record is Harry Howell with 1,160. Zibanejad will not get there. He would have to sign another contract beyond this, unless he's going to start playing 82 games every year. The average Zibanejad season in New York, he's played 67 regular season games when accounting for injuries. So even if we round up and say 70, it's pretty unlikely he's going to get to 1,160 by the end of this current contract. Now, if he's still playing at a passable level 5 years from now, 4 years from now, it's a conversation, and I'm sure the Rangers would be more than willing to have it, but depending on what the economic landscape of the NHL looks like in 2030, but he won't get there. Goals, it'll be interesting to see if he can get there. He's at 280 right now. Rod Gilbert has the record with 406. He averages 23 goals a season as a Ranger. Now, this year, he's over the 30-goal mark. I would assume next year, if the team is bad as well, he's going to have an opportunity to push that 30-goal mark as well, maybe even 35. We've seen the best hockey in terms of counting stats Zibanejad has played, has come on Ranger teams where the quality of the team is not great. The best hockey of Zibanejad's life comes in that 2019-2020 season, where he scores 41 goals in 58 games, including 5 of them in a single game, March 5th of 2020 against the Capitals. One of the great games I've been to in my life, one of the last things I was able to do before COVID really messed up the world. And goals-wise, it's going to be dicey if he can get to 406. He'd need to play about 5.5 more seasons. He's got 4 left on his contract. I think if he can push that 30-goal mark for at least 1 or 2 more of these seasons of remaining on that deal, he's going to have a real chance to get there. I think undoubtedly he'll end up being top 2 or 3, but he does have a real chance to end as the Rangers' all-time leading goal scorer. Assists, he won't get there. Brian Leetch has 741. That's more than double what Zibanejad has, his 376 at the moment. I think there's a good chance Zibanejad will end up being top 3 all-time in assists for the Rangers. He's already tied for first in hat tricks with Bill Cook with 9. He needs 1 more. He'll be the all-time record holder in that respect. As far as playoffs go, he's got 58 career points 58 career games played, 55 career points. That's pretty good. He's 6th all-time in Rangers history in playoff points with 55. Brian Leetch has 89. It remains to be seen when the Rangers will return to postseason play. It won't be this year. It probably won't be next year. The chances of him catching Brian Leetch are pretty small, but he can absolutely put together 1 or 2 more 10 or 11 points through 2 or 3 rounds and get into the top 3 or 4 as well there. When it comes to points per game, he's 9th all-time in Rangers history amongst players who have played at least 10 playoff games, sitting at a pretty nice number. Now, in big games, he has played what I define as 19 big games. I define big games as any playoff series game 5, 6, or 7. Those are the most high leverage. Those are the most important. Those are by definition the most valuable games a player can play. We talk about it all the time. Anybody can be a hero in the playoffs. Anybody can have a moment because it's a smaller sample. And in the case of Mika Zibanejad, he's played in 19 such games, 5, 6, or 7s, and he's recorded 21 points in those 19 big games. He's Mr. Game 6, of course, 10 points in 8 career Game 6s. He has 6 points in 3 career Game 7s. He has 7 points in 12 career Eastern Conference Finals games. That's the question, though. And that will ultimately be what defines Mika Zibanejad in terms of all-time greatness. Now, we get lost in the sauce a lot here in the sports world, and going by the numbers alone tells you a good chunk of the story, but there is color to this conversation, and we're going to talk mostly about that now in terms of the context of Zibanejad, because I have been a very adamant they made a mistake not doing everything, moving heaven and earth to try and get Jack Eichel in 2021. Eichel was 3 years younger. He was cheaper. Yes, he would have needed a new contract. Yes, he needed to get that replacement disc surgery. But Eichel is undoubtedly a better hockey player than Mika Zibanejad. But I also have the understanding that this is not in a vacuum. And the Rangers' ability to acquire Eichel was minimal. We know that there was a real reticence on the part of the Pagula ownership group that owns the Sabres to trade Eichel to the Rangers. There is an animosity there between the Buffalo and Rangers organizations for a few reasons. The way they poached Chris Drury as a player back in 2007-8, the way that they declined to allow Chris Drury to interview for the Sabres general manager job a couple years ago. Do I think that's the best way to run your franchise? No. Do I know those are the only two reasons the Sabres drove a hard bargain to get Eichel? No. Do I think that with hindsight, you probably just give them Lafreniere and Kakko and get it over with and you get Eichel here and you figure out the rest later? Yeah, you undoubtedly do that. But the reality of the situation is when we are evaluating the Rangers' tenure of Mika Zibanejad, you're going to look back at this guy as being a really important piece of the most successful window in the history of the Rangers franchise that didn't bear fruit of a Stanley Cup. Now, I've had this take for a while now, and I do think it bears true. This is the most successful window of Rangers hockey in the history of the franchise. From 2012 to 2010, this team is a consistent Stanley Cup contender for basically 9 of 13 years, 9 of 14 years. And in the context of the Rangers' history, where that original 6 era, you win the first 3 of your 4 cups. You go from 1940 to 1994 without winning a championship. You make a couple finals appearance in there sporadically, but you are one of the bottom 6 in an original 6 era. When the league expands, you struggle to adapt to that. You go to the Cup final in 1979, you lose there. You don't really get back to consistent contender status until the 2010s. The Jágr teams, 05, 06, they made the playoffs a couple times. They won some playoff rounds, which was integral to getting that first initial wave post-lockout Rangers teams going. And it was always going to be a matter of what would come after the Jágr, Nylander, Pruka wave of guys, because they just didn't have the volume of pieces to sustain that type of roster building for an extended period of time. Older, veteran-laden, expensive. You're dealing with an extremely flat cap environment where you're talking about the ceiling being $45-46 million. And that's a decade ago. That's 12, 13 years ago where we're talking about the maximum salaries combined being $44.5 million for an entire team of 18 skaters and 2 goalies, which feels like another lifetime ago in the context of we're seeing 130 million salary caps 2 or 3 years from now. But this is the best Rangers center of the 21st century. I think the only other players you can make arguments for, you could mention Derek Stepan. I think Stepan is probably the second best of that group. I would mention Derek Brassard, mostly for his playoff performances. You can make Vincent Trocheck an honorable mention if you'd like. I don't think his tenure has been long enough to justify inclusion in this conversation yet. I think there are guys who did shorter stints like Dubinsky, like Brad Richards, who played important roles in the times they did, but their accumulated accolades and stats don't really hold up. And I think ultimately you're going to look at Zibanejad as one of the defining players for this franchise in the first quarter of the 21st century. And that sounds so grand and so big, but you think about the teams that were going to Stanley Cup, that went to the Stanley Cup final, for example. Derek Stepan, Derek Brassard, Brad Richards, Dominic Moore, Brian Boyle as your 4th line centers, depending on which side of the offensive zone they were in or the defensive zone for handedness advantages and which guy was better at right versus left side. None of those guys as individually talented as Zibanejad. You think about the supporting casts on those teams. You think about Rick Nash, Marty St. Louis, Chris Kreider, Kevin Hayes. You go a little bit later, Carl Hagelin, JT Miller, Buchnevich. You go down that list, and basically the only guy who is definitively better Rangers tenure than Zibanejad is Panarin. The only Rangers forward post-2010 with an argument as to being a more important player and a better player than Zibanejad at the forward position is Artemi Panarin. Panarin's on the team 7 years of that contract. He leads the team in scoring 6 of the 7 years. Zibanejad will lead the team in scoring this year. This year being the last year Panarin was under contract. Panarin, of course, got traded to the Kings before the Olympic break. But I mention that because so much of the conversation about the Rangers, and justifiably so, over the last 5 years, has been oriented around winning a championship. That Chris Drury's hiring in the spring of 2021 was the starting gun of the race being fired. The second Chris Drury was hired, the race to become a Stanley Cup winning team was on. And that is a very refined window. You do not get that many kicks at the can. I was talking about this the other day with somebody, and I always come back to something. The late Howard Schnellenberger, who was the coach at the University of Miami, the coach who really kickstarted the University of Miami as being a national title contender in the late 70s. He said he was talking about his tenure at Miami because he left the Hurricanes to take a job in the USFL, which ultimately didn't come to bear fruit. There was no Miami expansion team in the United States Football League. And he ultimately went to, I believe, the University of Oklahoma and then a few other smaller schools. He bounced around from school to school before ultimately retiring. And he said, Cinderella does not get to go back to the ball. And I think that's really instructive for thinking about your windows of contention. And I think about it a lot because of the way being a Ranger fan has sculpted a lot of my life. As great as the Rangers have been over the last decade and a half, they got the third most playoff games played out of everybody over the last 15 years. I'm going to turn my notes over here, so excuse the sound of turning pages for those of you listening on audio. But the third most playoff games since the 2010-2011 season. The only teams are more Boston and Tampa Bay. They have the third most playoff game wins since 2010-2011. They have more playoff wins in that time than the Blackhawks, than the Panthers, than the Kings, than the Golden Knights. The only teams with more are the Bruins and the Lightning. And the Bruins got their 1 cup. Tampa Bay got 2. Tampa Bay has been to 3 cup finals. Tampa Bay very well could go back this year and be right back in the mix. And I bring that up because the Rangers never got back. They went to 1 Stanley Cup final with Henrik Lundqvist, who was a first ballot Hall of Famer. They have not gotten there yet with Shesterkin, who very well might be a first ballot Hall of Famer someday. The San Jose Sharks with Patrick Marleau and Joe Thornton and Brent Burns and Joe Pavelski, they went to 1. The Predators with Pekka Rinne and Roman Josi and PK Subban and Ryan Ellis and Matthias Ekholm and Philip Forsberg, they went to 1. The Capitals with Ovechkin, Backstrom, John Carlson, Braden Holtby, they went to 1. The St. Louis Blues, Pietrangelo, Ryan O'Reilly, Tarasenko, they went to 1. The Stars, the Dallas Stars, who we all agree have been one of the best franchises in the league the last 5 years, have been to 1 Stanley Cup final. The Avalanche, McKinnon, Makar, Landeskog, 1 Stanley Cup final appearance. And that's a very high bar. Making the cup final, winning the championship is the most challenging thing to do in this sport. We revere the winners because we understand collectively how challenging this is. At this point in my life now, I have resigned myself to more likely than not the Rangers will not do this. I do not think the Rangers are going to win a Stanley Cup in my life. That is not pessimism. That is not cynicism. That's math. The Rangers have been in existence 100 years. This is their centennial season of existence. They have won 4 Stanley Cups in 100 years. They won 0 cups between 1940 and 1994. With that framing, I will be lucky to get 1. And if I get 1, you never hear me complain again. Scouts honor, you would never hear me complain again if they won 1. But I bring this phrasing up because in my frustrations with Zibanejad have been the flashes, because there are moments where you look at him and you say, wow, that was really impressive. You think about the work he's been able to do at certain points, the games he's had in series against the Hurricanes or against the Penguins, and you see the flashes, the 5-goal game against Washington, where this is a guy when he's feeling his game is precise, is decisive and does not hesitate. And that has always been Zibanejad's drawback when he has gone into these long cold spells. Last year, the first 20 games or so was really rough. I go back to that 2021 season where he was dealing with long COVID. He did not play well. The first 27 regular season games of 2021, 11 points in 27 games. He ultimately finished with 50 and 54. He made it up for it down the backstretch. But that initial start to the season really set a tone of frustration. I think you saw it bubble over last year to a tipping point where he couldn't salvage it. You know, he could not get his hands back on the steering wheel. His confidence was really lacking. He lacked the decisiveness to his game. And that's what makes, when Zibanejad is at his best, there is a real precision and a lack of passiveness. You know, it's an assertiveness that I want the puck, I am going to make the play. And that manifested a lot in that 2019-2020 season where he drove the net more. It's why it was his single highest season in goal scoring. And that fifth goal, the game winner, the overtime game winner against Washington, the one that is the fifth goal in the 5-goal game where he decisively drives the net and beats the goalie high, that's the type of play that really opens your eyes to say, this guy has an impressive skill set. He has a really gifted toolbox, and he can accomplish a lot as a player. And that's really been the source of frustration for me. So when I talk about sliding doors, I mentioned Eichel Zibanejad as the number one center for this team as really being the era-defining sliding doors. There are other ones, of course. What if they don't sign Panarin? What if he signs with the Islanders? What does that do to their trajectory? If they don't win the Lafreniere lottery, or if they win the Jack Hughes lottery, there are so many individual moments along the course of the path to get here in talking about Zibanejad's 1,000 games that I come back to the Eichel one the most because that was a real time-sensitive one. Because Zibanejad was a couple of years older, the timeline was always going to be sped up with Panarin, with Trouba, with Chris Kreider, with Shesterkin. You had a set timeline. Now, Shesterkin a lot younger than the aforementioned. Shesterkin's 28 turning 29 or 29 turning 30. Forgive me for not remembering off the top of my head. But this is an organization that saw an opportunity in the Eastern Conference. You looked around 2021, the Hurricanes are a perennial playoff team, but we all look at with an air of skepticism as far as the playoffs go. We know the Capitals and the Penguins, they're starting to wind down. That is still the case now. The Islanders had gone to 2 straight conference finals, but were a bit of an older team, a lot of miles on the tracks. That ultimately fell apart. Matthew Schaefer has helped speed up their reclamation process, but they are definitely still a ways away from contender status. The Blue Jackets, they had a nice little run there. They won a playoff series. They went to the first round of the proper playoffs in 2020, but haven't been back since. The Flyers have been in a perpetual state of suspended animation, for lack of a better word. You have had opportunities, and the Devils, they have 2 playoff appearances this half decade. They've won 1 playoff series, albeit against the Rangers, but the Devils aren't particularly close now when you deal with the repercussions of some of the decisions they've made over the last handful of years. And that was the landscape the Rangers were looking at. Hell, earlier this year, we were talking about the idea that would the Rangers have the self-awareness to recognize, hey, we know the East isn't very good, but you need to make the right decision here. You need to trade Panarin. You need to trade Trocheck, Schneider. You need to entertain Lafreniere trades should one become available because of the fragileness of this all. And you might look at the East and say, all the Rangers need to do is have one good offseason. If they have the good offseason this summer, they could be next year's Buffalo. They could be next year's Washington. They could be next year's Pittsburgh or Detroit. And I push back on that wholeheartedly because those teams had young guys ready to ascend to take important roles. Now, Gabriel Perreault's emergence alongside Mika Zibanejad and Alexis Lafreniere has been really pleasant. I have greatly enjoyed watching Gabriel Perreault play post-Olympics and really get to sink his teeth into a meaty role, get told, hey, you're an important part of this team. You need to perform well, and then meet that moment. You know, it's really encouraging to see guys meet the opportunity in front of them because so many of these young guys for the Rangers have really hit a stop, start mentality for basically the first 3 or 4 years. You think Chris Kreider did not really fully solidify himself as a full-time NHLer until 2013-14. You know, he went to Hartford at the end of the 2013. Got a healthy scratch in one of the playoff games against the Bruins in 2013. John Tortorella was so fed up with him. And I bring these up not as, oh, I remember this, but there is so much historical context to evaluate these players and these decisions within. I think it makes for really good conversation and really good analytical exploration, because history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. It operates in cycles. And right now, the Rangers are in a 2017-18 situation where they could be honest with themselves and say, we're not there, we need to take some steps, or they're going to stubbornly try and push through, which it seems like they're going to do. And it's unfortunate for someone like Zibanejad, for someone like Adam Fox, for Shesterkin, for Lafreniere, for Perreault, guys who aren't done as important NHLers, but lack the organizational sense of direction to really give them a higher purpose, for lack of a better expression. You think about where they're at right now. They are in dead last in the Eastern Conference, and they are one of the 5 worst teams in the entire NHL. The minute they committed to Zibanejad in 2021, they set a timer. Now, whether that was 2026, 7, 5, 4, we didn't know. There was no way of knowing at the time how the next several years were going to play out. I have long been a proponent of the opinion they messed up by going to the conference final in 2022. That gave Chris Drury an elevated sense of where they were, how ready they were to compete. They were not ready to compete on a Stanley Cup caliber level. They took the wrong conclusions from that Tampa Bay series. They signed Trocheck to replace Ryan Strome. They make Jacob Trouba the captain. And they more or less said, we just got to try a little bit harder. We'd be a little bit more physical, and we can win. They lost to the Devils. They took a step back and said, it's Gallant's fault. Gallant's not the right messenger. They brought in Laviolette. They brought in Gustafsson. They brought in Jonathan Quick and Blake Wheeler. They leaned heavily on veterans and leadership. They have the best season in the history of the franchise. They get to that series against Florida. They cannot score at even strength to save their lives. Florida suffocates them. Florida wins its first of 2 consecutive cups. Now you are left sitting here with the debris. And Mika Zibanejad has never been a Stanley Cup caliber number 1 center. I have no reservation in saying that. You look at the last 15 Stanley Cup winners, and we can do this real quick because I know them. Barkov, no. Barkov, no. Eichel, no. McKinnon, no. Braden Point, no. Braden Point, no. Ryan O'Reilly, maybe, depending on which version of Ryan O'Reilly. Nick Backstrom, maybe, depends on which version of Nick Backstrom. Sid, no. Sid, no. Jonathan Toews, no. Kopitar, probably not. No, I wouldn't say that. Toews again, no. Kopitar, no. Patrice Bergeron, no. Jonathan Toews, no. 2009 is Pittsburgh against Sid, so no. Henrik Zetterberg, no. Ron Brindamore, I mean, we're going 20 years back. He's maybe better than 2 of the 20 guys. I think that's a really rough threshold. If you're looking to be the outlier, the exception to the rule as your governing philosophy as a franchise, I think you're going to miss the boat. And I think largely, and I think unfortunately for Zibanejad, he's going to become emblematic of this window of Rangers hockey, where he's a really good player. You know, he's 20th in points over the last 7 years in the entire league. That's nothing to sneeze at. That really is nothing to sneeze at when you're talking about the big picture. But when you have a player of that caliber, you need to give them an elite supporting cast. And Chris Kreider, perfect running mate for Zibanejad as long as they were together. Once they traded Buchnevich, they never really had the transition engine those 2 guys needed to carry the puck into the offensive zone, to really do the mechanical dirty work to get them to their best. It's why Zibanejad and Kreider were always their best off the rush, because they didn't want structure. They wanted 2-on-1s and 3-on-2s where they could use those cross-seam passes. They could use their foot speed. Zibanejad could use his positioning and his IQ to put Kreider in advantageous scoring positions. It's why they were so effective shorthanded a couple years ago when the Rangers penalty kill was one of the best in the league, and they were one of the best teams at creating shorthanded goals. This is an all-time great franchise player. I don't think he's going to reach the threshold of where we revere Lundqvist, Messier, Brian Leetch, Gilbert. I think he's firmly on that next tier down. I think he's very much amongst the equals with someone like an Adam Graves, who really good player, a couple of really good individual counting stat seasons, but a supporting cast member and somebody who played a really important role on good teams, but wasn't Mark Messier, wasn't Brian Leetch, wasn't Mike Richter. And I think that's a really interesting place to find yourself, because if things go differently in a handful of games, maybe we're talking about Zibanejad like those guys. And it's not over yet for Zibanejad at 33. He is not done as an NHLer. I think he's going to have a really good chance to break a couple more Ranger records for the franchise. I think undoubtedly he's going to end up being top 5 in a great majority of the statistical categories by virtue of his longevity. And longevity is nothing to sneeze at. When we are talking about what makes players great, consistently being available is up there as far as the most important traits. Sure. Would you have liked him to be a 1 point per game guy as opposed to a 0.8 point per game guy? Of course. But for what he is, and this is really one of the hard parts of being a sports fan as you become an adult. You need to make the time you have invested worth these experiences. I cannot sit here after the last 15, 16 years of watching Rangers hockey and say, I got nothing out of that. I can't do that. I cannot accept that. That is a calculated and frankly a little bit of a cold way to look at the world. It's not a zero-sum game because ultimately those feelings were real. Those moments were real. I will remember for the rest of my life him scoring that 5th goal to win the game against the Capitals, turning around to give the 2 Capitals fans sitting directly behind me the middle finger and telling them to get lost and get out of my building. In a season the Rangers were not going to make the real playoffs because that meant something to me. I will remember the rest of my life walking out of Game 6 against Ottawa in 2017, meeting my friends at the bar, who I went to the game by myself, $225, one of the last seats, and I think it was 210, and sitting there the entire game with my hands on my elbows on my knees, my mouth over my hands, and I know that makes for bad audio, but I sat there the entire game like that, didn't blink. I don't think I blinked once that entire game, and Zibanejad, Kreider, and Buchnevich played one of the best games that trio has ever played. The Rangers had the puck for what it felt like 3/4 of the game. They could not get one back past Craig Anderson, who that's a Rangers boogeyman. Craig Anderson, Jimmy Howard. It's never the great goalies that give the Rangers all-time problems. It's the guys who are good on occasion, like Craig Anderson and like Jimmy Howard, that always left the Rangers perplexed. But that Ottawa series, that was the best hockey I had seen that trio play. It took a while for them to get back there. I think about some of the performances against the Hurricanes in the postseason. He had a really good Game 6 in 2022. I think about the role he's played culturally on this team. I think a lot about how he has consistently been one of the more outward, soft-spoken leaders in that he wears it on his sleeve. And I know that annoys people, and it annoys me at times. I don't like when a guy is moping or defeated, but at the same time, I can acknowledge and look at the human side of this and say, I'm being wrong. I am being a jackass about this. This is a guy who is being honest, who is showing contrition that this is weighing on him, that this is causing him a problem. And I have been too quick at times to say, get over it. You have to keep going. And I've been really adamant that this is the exact type of player who, if you have the right cast with, you could get a little bit more out of. You think about a 54-goal Kreider season, what that did for Zibanejad's counting stats, what it did for Zibanejad's counting stats playing on elite power plays in 2022 and 2024. This is a very toolsy player that his teammates love, that his coaches love. You look at the role he played for Team Sweden at the Olympics. You look at how David Quinn, Gerard Gallant, Peter Laviolette, and Mike Sullivan have all unquestionably deployed him as their best center. And look, I've had my reservations about Zibanejad's defense. I do think it's overrated. I do think the fact that he's got a long reach and he's a decent skater gives him a perception advantage that maybe some other players wouldn't be afforded in spite of the defensive results. Zibanejad is the guy who gets the hand up after the shot has already been released. He's very big on that. If you go back and look at some of those playoff games against Tampa Bay and Florida, and look, if I want to be mean, you point to the 0 points in game 6 or 7s against Florida and Tampa Bay. That's not a great look. And I want to make sure I have that right. So excuse me while I turn my notes over here because I don't want to slander the guy if I'm wrong. Excuse me. He has 2 points in the 4 career game 5 and 6s against Tampa Bay and Florida in 22 and 24. So half a point per game in those games. And it's cruel to sum a guy's career up in those 4 games. Those are the 4 biggest games of Zibanejad's career as a Ranger. The Rangers got really close twice. They needed just a little bit more. And as the second or third best forward on this team, there was an expectation that Zibanejad be that guy. But with hindsight, with a matured perspective, I am very grateful that Mika Zibanejad has been a Ranger as long as he has been. He's a very easy guy to root for. He's a guy that it's very easy to feel bad for, because when you wear your heart on your sleeve, you invite yourself to criticism from people who lack the ability to show some empathy and to really understand the problems at hand. Last year's Rangers season was an unmitigated disaster that, in almost any other context, results in everyone getting fired and a whole-scale reevaluation of how the organization operates. Now, James Dolan is not, of course, the most conventional operations guy, but it would have made sense that last year be the reset point, especially being that Chris Drury needed a new contract. There was a world where you could have reset everything, and maybe we're talking about the team in a different light right now. But with all of that in mind, you appreciate these guys for what they are. Someone like Zibanejad is someone you will talk about as a hockey fan the rest of your life. If you're a fan of the Penguins or the Hurricanes, this is a guy whose name you curse under your breath because he got you one or two times in a first or a second round, and that was the difference between your team getting another crack, another kick at the can. And ultimately, that's your goal as a hockey team. You want as many kicks at the can as you possibly can. And do I think Zibanejad has been unfairly critiqued at times? Yes, by me included. I have been on his case a lot during the 2022 to 2024 window because they only needed that much more. And that's such a small gap to be critical about. That's such a small margin to harp on. But that's the difference between winning a championship and making a conference final. And this is someone I'm going to think about a lot for the rest of my life as a hockey person, because he was really close a handful of times, and his story's not done. Like I said, this is someone who is going to have a real chance to be a top 5 player in a lot of statistical categories, who maybe gets one or two more kicks at the cans in a postseason. You look at some of the guys like a Steve Yzerman or Joe Sakic, who ultimately didn't win a cup until they were in their early to mid-30s. It's never over until it's over. Until Mika Zibanejad hangs up those skates and that helmet for the last time, he has a chance to change his story and to continue writing new chapters in that story. Whatever the next phase of Rangers hockey looks like post-2025, 2026, Mika Zibanejad will be an integral part of that story, and someone who might either speed up the inevitable decline and ultimate subsequent rebuild, or might delay and stave off that impending rebuild through improved play in his late 30s. This is someone who we have seen continue to play and play his best hockey on bad teams, because the stakes are a little bit lower, the pressure's a little bit lower, he's a little more free, he's a little more creative, and he's more decisive, and it allows him to be a better player than he has been at times. And celebrate this moment. You don't get this all that often. 420-ish guys in the history of the sport have reached this threshold. 40 or 50 have done it at least stopping by as Rangers. I started writing down a handwritten list of all of the guys on the Wikipedia article with 1,000 games, and that bottom 8-9 lines is like half of the total guys who've hit the 1,000-game mark, because I just ran out of space, and at that point, I figured the illustration was effective enough to indicate that we're talking 50 or 60 guys maybe in the history of the sport have done this as Rangers. Zibanejad is a really good dude who deserves his moment in the sun. You wish it could have turned out a little bit better for him at a few key junctures, but this is a good dude who deserves this moment. That'll do it for this first edition of the Theory of Hockey podcast. Please, please, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts or over on YouTube. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. It greatly helps the show's visibility. If you're over on YouTube, leave comments. Join the Discord server. The link is on YouTube. It's on the link tree. The videos and content will come. This is one, but many ideas I have, and I'm grateful that anybody cares what I have to say about hockey. Thank you so much for dropping in for any part of this. If you did, I will see you guys on Wednesday. Until then, enjoy the moment, Mika Zibanejad. You earned it.